Welcome to Vineyard Boise. It's our vision to make the invisible God visible wherever He places us. We come together on Sundays to worship and fellowship corporately. But we know that church isn't just about Sunday. It's about a lifelong, day-to-day following of Christ with other believers. We invite you to join us, just as you are. If you'd like to support our ministry, visit vineyardboise.org and click the Give Online button.
This morning, we're of course on Palm Sunday. Here's what we've called the message. We called it Surprised by Hope. Surprised by Hope. And actually, these Stations of the Cross, they're going to be looking at the last events of Jesus through the lenses of hope. And, at its core, that's what Palm Sunday is about. It's about expectations. It's about anticipation. It's about awakened hope. Palm Sunday is about the longing for divine intervention. The longing for our Creator, for our God, to break into our circumstances. And it's our personal circumstances, it's our own life, our family's life. It's to break into our circumstances, but also our nation, our world. We look out and we see what's going on in the world. We read stories that we just, go, oh, not again. And sometimes, as a Christian, I read the news or I hear the news and I just think, oh God, would you just come back now? Just relieve us from the violence and the way that we treat one another, the disposable way we treat one another, the self-interest that we live with. That's what Palm Sunday is about. It's an awakening of hope. It's an anticipation, an expectation that God has not abandoned His creation, that He is in fact pursuing His creation, and He's going to make all things new, and we're in the middle of that He's begun that process, and that we're waiting for the completion of it. That's what Palm Sunday is about. So the name actually comes from the passage that Marcus read to us this morning. That's one of the places it comes from. It's Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on the Sunday preceding his resurrection. Jesus rose on a Sunday, so it's the Sunday before that. He enters into Jerusalem, and he comes into a very welcoming environment. It's not the environment he'll experience just within a few days and hours. Friday he's arrested and crucified, and the whole crowd is against him. But when he comes in on Sunday, he comes in riding a donkey. And the crowd, as he rides into town, they lay down their coats on the ground for him to walk on, for the donkey. They have branches, like palm branches, and they're waving those and they're laying them down. It comes out of one of the Psalms. And the idea is it's actually a hero's welcome, the welcome of a military victor. And historically, even going back a couple hundred years back to the Maccabees, this is the way that in Israel they would welcome a conquering hero. The difference is that there's a couple things that are not quite right in this passage. First of all, Jesus hasn't won anything yet. There's no victory. This is anticipation that this is the Messiah that we've been waiting for. This might be the one who's been promised, the long-awaited king, the descendant of David that we've been waiting for. But he hasn't done it yet. And so that's a little bit not quite right. And then secondly, he's riding a donkey, which in terms of a military ride is not all that impressive, right? It's not all that intimidating. Like a conquering king should be riding like a war horse or a chariot, right? But he's riding a donkey. So it's the equivalent, instead of riding into town on a tank, you ride in a Prius, right? Which is nice, it's fuel efficient, and it's cute. It's just not that intimidating. So there's some things about this Palm Sunday. Here's what that tells us, that somehow there's an expectation of the people. They're welcoming him as somebody who's going to make things right. But maybe it's not going to be in the way they expect. And the reality is, they, like us, would have settled for something far less than what God was doing. And as human beings, so often we want God to intervene in our circumstances. And we have an idea of what that would look like. But we would settle for something so small compared to this vast, amazing thing that He's actually doing that we just can't see it because we're so close to it. For them, they were waiting for they wanted somebody to set them free from Rome. At this time, Rome was the world power. They had dominated the entire, known world. And they're living under Rome's power. They're having to pay tribute to Rome. Rome's occupying Jerusalem. They're not free people. And so really, they would settle for just Rome being kicked out. And that's as they're welcoming Jesus in, that's what they're looking for. So let me just say this. Whether it's Rome in their day and the circumstances they were longing for, and they also wanted a Messiah who would do other things. They welcomed Jesus into town because he fed them. They were hungry. Because he healed them. They were sick. Because he could intervene in the brokenness of the world. And so they wanted all of those things just like we do. But something happened at Palm Sunday, and Palm Sunday was where for them, they were just entering into the Passover season, and Passover was a time when they told the stories of how God had broken into their past, how God had broken in for the purpose of redemption. And the language of redemption, it actually comes from slavery, that to purchase someone out of slavery. You've redeemed them. And so in the same way that God had redeemed Israel out of slavery in Egypt, at Passover, they would recount that story for the purpose of awakening hope that God's going to do something again in our day. And so this is what Palm Sunday is about. It's the awakening of hope. But understand this. Hope for change is rooted in the awareness and the acknowledgement that something's wrong, that something's not right. If you're completely content with everything as it is, then there's no longing for change. There's no hope for something different. Palm Sunday is about acknowledging that there's things that are not right, that things need to be made new, things must be made different. It's actually being enveloped in darkness that makes one long for and appreciate the light. It's actually being enveloped in shades of gray and black that highlights the beauty of color. So this year, as we look at the Easter story, as we move into Easter, we're looking at it through the lenses of Ruth. And we have this backdrop that Jesse and Dottie and Dom have been creating for us. It's part of coming out of Vine Arts. But you see behind all of these black strips, there's actually a picture of beauty. It's actually a picture of creation, of culture within creation. So it's fields. I mean, if you could see it, it's really pretty, right? I'll tell you, I've seen it. It's this landscape, and you see buildings in the background, and it's a blue sky, and the sun's shining through, and there's clouds and birds and flowers. And it's there, but it's being hidden by all of this darkness. And it's different strips because the darkness of fallen creation manifests itself in many different ways. And there's little glimpses of light breaking through, but it's still overwhelmingly black. This is the world of first century Israel. This is our world. So we're going to pick up this morning in the book of Ruth. Pick up in 1:1. Read you the first 5 verses. That's the setting. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab, and they remained there. Country of Moab. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Let's just pause there and talk about that's the setup for this whole story that we're going to be looking at over these next 2 weeks. I would encourage you, Pastor Mike writes devotions for us that are designed to take us personally into the passage that we're going to be studying the following Sunday. That's our discipleship model is not really based on Sunday. It's based on our life together in Scripture. Sunday is a part of that, but our devotional life throughout the week is actually much more important than what happens right here. Because it's about us making space to have a personal encounter with God. So those devotions are available as you leave the room today. They're on both sides of the doors, just on the stands there. You can also sign up to get them online if you'd like to have them emailed to you each day. But as we're moving through the text, Mike's actually going to have us reading the text each day. We're moving through enough text that I'm going to be hitting parts of it and overviewing it. So I'd encourage you to be using your devotions this week. But these first 5 verses give us the setting for the whole thing. Here's what we find out. We find out, first of all, that chronologically, this is in the time when the judges ruled. How many of you were here last week? Raise your hand if you were here last week and you heard the final message in Judges. Okay? I'm sorry. No, you know what? Actually, in God's amazing, honestly, his amazing grace and power, in what I would say is one of the darkest passages of the Bible, possibly maybe apart from the crucifixion, one of the darkest passages in the Bible, we saw people come to know Jesus last week. And so that is a testimony to God's grace. But this is the setting for the book. And if you weren't here last week, what I would encourage you to do is to go online and watch the message, because you really can't appreciate this story if you don't understand the time that it was set in. So on our website, we've made it really easy to get to last week's message. That kind of olive green bar at the top of the screen there, there's a link right there for Judges for that last message. Or you can go to the media and resources link, I think, and you can find it there as well. But here's the time of the Judges. It was a time in Israel's history that was spiritually, socially, and culturally very dark. The repeated phrase in the last 5 chapters of the book was, this was a time when every man, every woman did what was right in their own eyes. Everybody's operating out of self-interest. I'm going to do what's best for me, regardless of how it costs others. Everybody was operating out of self-idolatry. A time when every man did what was right in their own eyes. So in Ruth, we switched from like the wide-angle lens. Last week, as we closed that story, we said, this is actually all 12 tribes are involved in these final 5 chapters. This was comprehensive. It was all of Israel. It was a wide-angle view of what was happening in Israel at this time. And so then our author tells us, well, in this time that was so dark, socially, spiritually, economically, and in this time that was so dark, we're going to zero in on one person's life, the life of one family, and specifically the woman within this family, Naomi. And we're going to take a close-up view at her life. What did the darkness of this time of the Judges look like in her life? That's what it's like chronologically. It's set during that time. Geographically, we found out the setting was Bethlehem. Bethlehem is only about 8 miles from where the final scene in Judges took place. Final scene with the Levite and his concubine and all that whole scene, that was 8 miles away from Bethlehem. So that's about the distance from here to Roaring Springs. Okay? Just in terms of context, you can think that setting that we read about last week that we experienced, this is set in that time. So it's a time that's dark spiritually, socially, culturally. It's also a time that's dark economically. We find out that there was famine in the land. Ironically, the name Bethlehem, it actually means bread basket or house of bread. And yet there was a famine that was so severe. It wasn't a famine that Elimelech and his family could just kind of ride out and wait till, just kind of live off their pantry and wait till next season. It was so extreme that and severe and sustained that Elimelech actually sells their family allotment. And within Israel, apart from family, there's probably nothing more important than land. Okay, the land had been promised to them. This was the promised land that had been promised to Abraham and his descendants hundreds of years before them that the Hebrew people had been waiting for. And when they at last secured the land and they each had a personal allotment of the land was precious to them. And Elimelech has sold his allotment off and left the land because he doesn't believe he can provide for his family. So he leaves, and then secondly, here's an indicator of how severe this is. He moves to Moab. Okay, so we need to talk about Moab. Here's a map real quickly. You see Moab. Bethlehem is towards the left-hand side of the map, over there just above the Judah. That's Bethlehem. If you follow the red line, he's going to go down to Moab. Moab is actually a different country. Okay, he doesn't go to a different tribe of Israel. He goes to a different nation. This is a foreign nation. And what we don't necessarily appreciate without revisiting the cultural context is that Moab and Israel were the bitterest of enemies. Going back, and they've got a long, sordid history. Like a very sordid history. You go back to Genesis 19 and you find out the origin of the Moabites. And they were actually very distant relatives of the Hebrew people at their beginning, but the trees have gone different directions, and now they're enemies. They're very hostile to one another. And there's been recent things that have happened that you can read about, like in Numbers 22 to 25. There's a sustained story about this conflict between Moab and Israel. And it ends with Israel, the men of Israel, and here's the language of Scripture, they began to whore themselves with the women of Moab. And as a result of that, the women of Moab invited them to worship with them, to worship to their gods instead of the God of Israel. And in so doing, they brought judgment on the entire nation of Israel. The men did that. And the primary god, the kind of the namesake of the Moabite people was a god named Chemosh, who was renowned for worship of him always involved child sacrifice as a burnt offering. So when we read that the men of Israel whored themselves with the women of Moab and begin to worship their gods, we have this understanding of why this was so offensive to God that they were sacrificing their babies as burnt offerings and thinking that this was an act of worship to the god Chemosh. Okay? As a result of all that, the end result of all that is that there has been a prohibition put on the people of Moab. And there's actually a place in Deuteronomy that says no Moabite will ever enter into the assembly of God to the 10th generation. And that word 10th generation probably doesn't mean count 10 generations and then they're in. 10 was a picture of completeness, so it probably means forever. Like they are never to enter God's presence. So this is the history of Israel, and Elimelech, he's desperate for food, and that's where he goes, to this foreign nation. Elimelech and his sons appear to have forsaken God. The scripture doesn't come right out and say this, and so we may not catch this, but to the Hebrew person reading the story, to the Israelite reading the story, reading that he sold his family allotment, and because he didn't trust God to provide and to make a way for them in the midst of famine, he sold his allotment and he moved to Moab. People would perceive that as he's lost faith in God. Secondly, his children's names, the boys' names, those aren't Hebrew names, those are Canaanite names. And so the very fact that he's named his children Canaanite names is indicative of where they are. We also see that his sons marry Moabite women. If you know the history of men of Israel and Moabite women, this was not a good move. This was not a move towards God. And we'll see that they have their own gods at this point. So, if we put the map back up, you see that Reuben's not that far away. If these boys want to be faithful to God, they can go up to the tribe of Reuben and get wives, if nothing else. But they don't. So that's our setting. And then within 10 years, Elimelech dies, as do both of his sons. There's no cause given. But if you think about Naomi, here's a woman who at this time had a husband and 2 sons. She had a secure future. And in the space of just 10 short years, she loses all 3 of them. And many of us have lost a close person, a relative, a spouse, some cases a child or a parent. And we know the ache of grief, of death, when we lose someone that's close. And she's not only experienced that once, but she's experienced it 3 times in a row. And she's left with nothing except for 2 foreign daughter-in-laws. Naomi is now an immigrant in a hostile foreign nation with no family. You have to stop and appreciate this. In the patriarchal culture in which she lived, in the ancient Near East, this was cataclysmic for a woman. This was absolute disaster. Women in the ancient Near East, they were almost entirely dependent, both socially and financially, on the men in their lives, beginning with their fathers, and then with their husbands, and eventually with their sons, and also with their extended family. Women were almost entirely dependent on them. Now, with no male protector provider, she's not only has she's lost her husband or her sons, but she's isolated in this foreign country. With no male protector provider, they were almost entirely dependent on society at large. This is the equivalent of homelessness in our society. Naomi was absolutely ruined. So here's her options. 1, she can lean into her dowry. She can cash out her dowry. And we talked about this last week, that sometimes what would happen is when someone got married, her husband would provide a dowry to her father that would be held in case he should die before she did, or in case he abandoned her or divorced her. That there would be a nest egg for her to be sustained by. It's kind of a life insurance policy in reality. But she doesn't seem to have that. Likely they burned through it when things were so tough that they had to sell everything and move to Moab. They probably exhausted that fund if there was one then. Secondly, so that's not an option. Secondly, she could remarry. The challenge is, who would she remarry? Again, she's living in a foreign land. We're going to find out that she's old enough that she can't bear children anymore. She's beyond childbearing age. And so this is a time when marriage wasn't just entered into just because someone had a close relationship and thought, I'd like to spend more time with you. Marriage in the ancient Near East, in all cultures, was entered into to extend family, to have more children, or to extend influence. Like, this is a family that could increase my influence. We'll create a bond here that will unite our families and we'll be stronger together. And love then became a part of that, but it wasn't the driving force. So she has nothing to offer. She's actually a liability. Should someone want to marry her, if someone even considered it, well, she's not going to have any more kids, and she actually doesn't bring any influence. She's a liability. So she can't get married. She can't find a job. We're going to find out that if she's too old to bear children, she's probably too old for significant manual labor, at least in some sort of sustained way. So she can't get a job. And so her last option, which is the one she takes, she can return. She can go back to Israel, because homelessness in Israel at least seems preferable to homelessness in Moab. Verse 6, then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. Okay, she doesn't return because of a better economy or because the housing market was really favorable for buyers. She just heard there was food. That's the level of her desperation, basic needs. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant each of you find rest each of you in the house of her husband. And she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and they wept. She's encouraging them, hey, stay here. You're more likely to find a spouse, another husband, if you stay here in your own people. You're not going to find one back here where you will be with me, because you're going to be an enemy once we get there. They said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I'm too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. The hand of the Lord has gone out against me. When she talks about having more sons, she's referring to a provision within the Hebrew law that if a man died without having sons to inherit the property, to be heirs, that his brother was to take his widow in and impregnate his widow and raise up sons in his name, so that the family allotment would continue, the family line would continue. So she's referring to that, and she's like, that's not going to happen. More importantly, though, in this thing, her view of what God is doing is that the hand of the Lord is against her. Why does she believe this? It's because she's evaluating what God is doing through the lenses of her circumstances. She's considering her life, her circumstances, the loss, the sustained loss, and the desperation of her life. And she looks and she's like, clearly, God doesn't love me. In fact, it seems like he's against me. The beautiful thing about this story is the narrator doesn't talk much about God. He allows the characters to talk about their view of God. And their view of God is a moving target based on whatever circumstances they're experiencing. This is the fickleness of human nature, is that we evaluate God by the circumstances surrounding us, by whatever is the closest to us. And so right now she's saying it's really bitter. But when something positive happens, just the beginning of something positive in chapter 2, she's like, oh, I think God loves us again. It's human nature. I'm capable of that, so are you. Ruth 1:14. Then they, meaning Orpah and Ruth, they lifted up their voices and they wept. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall become my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more so, if anything but death parts me from you." This is a surprising love from this foreign Moabite woman. Surprising in that she's attached to her mother-in-law. She actually attaches her own life and future to this destitute widow. And understand that when she's an immigrant, but as Tim Keller points out so beautifully, most immigration happens because people are longing for a better life. You've never talked to an immigrant who says, "Why did you leave your homeland to come to this place?" Immigrants leave for a better life. She's actually leaving for what she can only expect to be a worse life. She's going somewhere where she will now be the enemy, where she will be the foreign person. And the only person she knows is a homeless, destitute, bitter widow. She's leaving her household. Her parents are still alive. She's leaving her household, her people, her hope for a new husband. I mean, if she stays in Moab, she can get remarried and have a family. She's saying goodbye to all of that, which is just a beautiful, selfless love. Now she will be the foreign immigrant. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" This is a small town. Bethlehem at this time, maybe 200 people. So these are Naomi's friends, and they look at her and they don't even recognize her because the years have been so hard on her. And they squint and they go, "Is that Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi," which means pleasant. She says, "Call me Mara," which means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full and the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? When she left for famine, but at least her future was secure. She had a husband, she had 2 sons. She comes back completely empty, utterly depleted. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. This is God's word. Throughout the text, as we move through the next 3 chapters, Ruth is going to be always identified as the Moabite. Because the author wants us to remember she is this foreign woman. She's this enemy nation of Israel. And so what comes out of her is this surprising love, surprising faithfulness. So what's next? Well, it's to be continued. You got to come back next week, find out what happens to Ruth and Naomi. But here's where we're going to make a shift. And we're going to shift some, over 3,000 years from that story of here's big picture, the dark time in the nation of Israel during the time of the judges. Here's specifically what the darkness looked like in Ruth's life and Naomi's life. And now we're going to look at what the darkness looks like in our lives. We're going to start with a story of one person, and we're going to look at Sherry's story.
I'm from here in Garden City. My mom came here to Boise when she was like a young adult, and she didn't really know how to be a mom herself, but we were kind of left to raise ourselves and to take care of each other. My mom drank a lot. And she used to go to this bar, the Hi Ho, here on Shinden. But it was like a Wednesday night. She had gone that night, and my littlest sister fell in the canal, and we couldn't find her, and she died. They found her down here by the fairgrounds. After that point, we lost Mom to us in a lot of ways. She just moved us to, we went camping, but we just stayed camping. Part of my sister and I, it was like an adventure for us. She always say, "Sherry, let's go explore." And we We just grew up on that river, on Boise River. I think I had said something to the teacher one time when I was sick and they needed to send me home, and I didn't really have a home to be sent home to. The police came and they asked to talk to us, and my mom said we had to speak to them. And I don't remember what was said that day, but I remember thinking that I could clean up the campsite and that I could make it okay somehow. There was like mountains of beer cans and needles on the ground, and just a lot of dirtiness to our life. The police came back about a week later, and my mom saw them coming, and she turned and she walked off into the woods. So they asked us to pack our stuff, and they took us, and I said, how long will we be gone for? And they said, oh, maybe the weekend, or maybe a couple weeks. But we never went back. We never went back to Mom. But there was a part of me that stopped growing there at 11 because I wanted my family. Foster care was like stepping into a different world than what we knew. It was a nice home that we moved to, and they had food in the cupboards. I still wanted my family, and I, somewhere around 13, 14, started running away to get back to my family. But it didn't go very far because, of course, when you get picked up, then you get taken back. And then I just started into this cycle of getting in trouble. And then the more that I would leave, the situations that I'd end up were places that I just shouldn't be. And I remember the first time that I drank. And I remember thinking, this is what makes me happy. I've been in every form of institution. Group home and mental hospital and juvie and later into life, into jails. And I remember like one of the first times, I think in my 20s, that I had gone to jail, and I remember that institutional smell of the sheets. And I remember thinking that night, if there was a feeling of coming home to something, this is it for me. This is it. So I was young when I got pregnant with my first daughter. I was 18, I was 19 when I had her. But the only thing I knew to get out of where I was at in life, to be able to be clean and sober, was to completely isolate myself from the world that I knew. Which I don't know in the end if that was any healthier or not, but that's what I did. I had a few kids at this point. And I was in a relationship where, even though I had pulled away from the world to try and be clean and sober, the man that I was with in life had no intentions of getting clean and sober. I started coming to church here. It was terrifying to me because there were so many people. Even before it was as big as it is now, I remember coming into worship. I would just bawl every time. I would try and get outside just to get some space, and I remember people would speak to me and they would say, "Are you okay?" And I'd just be crying, and they'd say, "Can we pray for you?" And I was like, "No, just let me just let me be." But I kept coming. I couldn't stop drinking, and I remember calling and asking for help, like those helplines. And they said, "Well, do you have children?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, who do you have to take care of your children?" And I said, I don't have anybody to take care of my children." And then they said, "Well, then the state will probably take your kids away from you." And I hung up the phone. There was one I had realized that he had taken the money orders that I had to pay the utilities, and he was mad at me for not having what he wanted. And like he had pushed me down the stairs, and I remember yelling up at him like, why do we do this? And he was like, because we love each other. And I said, if you loved me, you would leave. I took the baby that morning and I got in the van. But before that, I had started drinking. And I had prayed to God that morning, forgive me for what comes out, but I said, I'm sorry that I'm drinking again. Because I'd had a lot of talks with God about this. And I said, I give you my spirit to do with what you will, because I can't do this anymore. And I left with her, and I ran into a fence, and I knew the police were coming, and I walked away from my baby, knowing that they would come and get her. And I went back to the apartment, and I held the other two, and I cried, and I drank, and I apologized to them because I knew what was coming. Oh, I wouldn't want to walk back through that year. But it was a year of surrender. Like, I surrendered everything. Like, I gave my children over to God daily, moment to moment. And they were blessed with the most amazing foster mom. And she sent me just like rolls and rolls of film. And she prayed for me. And she told me that God loved me. I got out of prison and went to a halfway house out in Caldwell. And then I had moved in with a pastor and his wife out there. And then the state started to place the children back with me. I entered another relationship of someone that I had met through church out there. It seemed like a healthier relationship, but it was the exact same relationship that took me going to prison to get out of it. It was almost word for word what they say to me. I relapsed again. I ended up in jail again. And I remember that point. That's when I started to pray for God to put in my life the people that He wanted in my life and in whose lives He wanted me in. When I got out of jail that time, that's when I had came across Lynn again. I was sitting on the side of the road on Milwaukee. Lynn drove by and she said, I recognize your eyes. Where do I know you from? And she had taught a parenting class when I was in prison the first time. And I just told her what was going on. Like, I was in drug court. I was living at a homeless shelter. I had an unreal amount of expectations on what I needed to do daily to get through this. Lynn had asked, what do you need? How can I help you?
Pretty courageous young lady, sharing her story with us. The invitation is for us to for the purpose, again, of awakening hope, we have to look at the circumstances. What does it look like for us to live in a fallen world? What does it cost us? And again, it manifests itself differently in our lives, but for us to actually have that awakened hope, that anticipation of God making all things new, we have to acknowledge the darkness. So here's the invitation. We've looked at Ruth's story, Naomi's story. We've looked at Judges. We looked at Sherry's story. Now it's each one of our turns. If you look inside the boxes on your table, there's a stack of black Post-it notes. Would you get those out? Now the privacy of a black Post-it note is you can write on it and nobody can read it. So what I'm going to ask you to do, here, let me just tell you this and telegraph this a little bit. I'm not going to ask you to share this with the other people at your table. This is between you and God. But would you take a moment to just take ownership of what is the darkness of living in a fallen world look like in your life? Here's the question. How has the darkness of living in a fallen world expressed itself in your life? You might think through spiritually. What does it look like spiritually? What does it look like relationally or socially? What's it look like financially? Medically. There's all kinds of ways it manifests itself, but just take some time to just write those things down. As we awaken anticipation and hope, let's be prepared to give God the brokenness. Go ahead and do that for a moment. Some of these circumstances might be self-inflicted, results of choices you made. Some of them might be completely circumstantial, where you're just a victim of someone else's choices. Still brokenness. Where would you long for God to break in? If you're done, you can take more time if you want. You can also turn that over and think about someone else's life, someone you're close to, maybe a loved one, a child, a spouse, a friend, someone who you know they're experiencing the brokenness very palpably right now. And you want to pray for them. You want to bring their circumstances before God and say, God, would you intervene? Would you intervene in the brokenness of their lives? What you're writing here, it's not a blank check that God has to cash. We don't determine how God breaks in, how God redeems circumstances. Like I said earlier, sometimes we can only see what's so close right in front of us. We see it, that's all we can see because it's right so close. God's often doing something so much bigger, and sometimes it takes more time. But he's making all things new, and he does all things well. And so what we can do is we can do what Naomi did. Naomi turned and she walked towards Israel. She walked back to the place of God's faithfulness. This was a statement of trust. She'd heard a little glimpse of God doing something, and she moved towards that. So the invitation for us today is to move towards that, not knowing how he's going to redeem these things or when, but as a statement of worship, as a statement of trust, saying, God, I give you these things. I give you the brokenness of my life. I give you the brokenness of my friend's life, my children, my spouse. I give you this and invite your redemption. I invite you to break into this very thing. And in the same way that Naomi, she walked towards Israel, we're just going to have a chance to actually physically move across the stage, and even around the perimeters, there's these little wire baskets. If you want to, as we sing this last song of worship, when you're ready, if you would like to offer this to God in trust, you can walk up and just drop it in one of the baskets. And what's going to happen with that is during the week, we're going to add these to all of these black strips so that as we come into Easter and we're welcoming God's redemption, we're saying, I'm in there. I've got ownership for the brokenness, for the darkness, and I'm asking God to break into my life. I'm asking for his redemption. It's a statement of trust. It's a statement of worship. So would you stand with me? And if you want to take this home and you want to add more stuff to it and bring it back this week, you're welcome to do that. But for now, as we worship, when you're ready, if you'd bring it to the baskets, and then I'm going to ask our prayer team if you would spread out, not on the stages so people can get here, but if you would spread out kind of on the wings, underneath the screens and moving towards the walls. If you need prayer this morning, even if you want to ask about what it looks like to come to God for the first time, if you've never experienced his presence in your heart, you can talk to them about that. But if you have prayer needs this morning, we'd love to pray with you. Let's worship.
Are you hurting and broken within? Overwhelmed by the weight of your sin? Jesus is calling. Have you come to the end of yourself? Do you thirst for a drink from the well? Jesus is calling. And oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Leave behind your regrets and mistakes. Come today, there's no reason to wait. Jesus is calling. Bring your sorrows and trade them for joy. From the ashes a new life is born. Jesus is calling. We'll sing together, come to the altar. And oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was brought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood. And oh, what a Savior. Isn't he wonderful? Sing hallelujah. Christ is risen. Bow down before him, for he is Lord of all. Sing hallelujah. Christ is risen. Let's declare that today. Oh, what a Savior we have. Oh, what a Savior. Isn't he wonderful? Isn't he wonderful? And sing hallelujah, 'cause Christ is risen. Bow down before him. Bow down before him. For he is Lord of all. Sing hallelujah. come to the altar. And oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood. And oh, what a Savior. Isn't he wonderful? Sing hallelujah. Christ is risen. Bow down before him. Bow down before him. For he is Lord of all. Sing hallelujah. Christ is risen. God, we bring all our burdens to you this morning. Every broken place, everything that needs to be restored, we bring them to your feet today, Jesus. And we trust in your faithfulness, in your sovereignty. We trust in you, in your goodness, Lord. Thank you that your yoke is easy and your burden is light. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. You guys are dismissed this morning. If you do need prayer, our prayer team is available. We'd love to pray with you. Have a great week and come and engage with all that we're doing for Easter, Stations of the Cross in the chapel, and our Good Friday service. We'll see you there.